COVID inquiry restarts today. Did you even know it stopped? With the stage the politicians would have been dreading. The module on core decision-making and political governance. Now, if you, like me, have no idea what that even means, we're hopefully going to get an answer from the founder of Us For Them, which campaigns, of course, on behalf of children and does a brilliant job, Molly Kinsley. Molly, very good morning to you. How are you doing?
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
Very well indeed. Welcome to the brand new, hugely expensive studio that we've got here for the Independent Republic of Mike Graham. We've been turbocharged, so very nice to see you. Let's talk about the COVID inquiry. I mean, one, I didn't realise it had actually stopped. I'm never really sure when it's on. Nobody seems to know how it's running. And I don't even know what this next stage is supposed to be about. Talks about governance, talks about, you know, politicians. What's going on?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the first point to make here is you've had a very extended break. So the last public hearings were at the other end of summer, so back in June, early July, I believe. So they've they've had this 2.5 month really break, which isn't to say they've not been doing things behind the scenes. Right. They may have been, but there's not been any evidence of that. And, you know, given one of the things that the inquiry has already come under a lot of fire for is this very protracted timetable, which is seeing it run into, you know, half a decade or more. Why have we had a 2.5 month break is the first question. I think the second question is the lack of transparency, as you've said. And, you know, just before coming on your show, Mike, I had a look to see if the witness schedule for this week was up. Yes, and it is up for this week, but not beyond this week. And this was very much a pattern that we saw in Module 1, where the announcement of the public witnesses was made really just with days to spare. And that gives no one who is trying to follow the inquiry, to hold the inquiry itself to account, any real notice to prepare. You would have thought for something like this, particularly over a very lengthy and relaxed, one might say, timetable, they ought to be able to give us much more notice of what's going on. To answer your question about what is this module about, this is the key module. So this is the module that will examine the key pandemic non-pharmaceutical interventions. So it won't look at vaccines, that will come later. But this is the module that ought to be looking at things like face masks, like the original lockdown, like subsequent lockdown, like the rule of 6, like all these crazy rules that we may suspect didn't always do much, but came with huge harms. And this module ought to be looking at the decision-making processes that key ministers and key advisors, were, you know, led to these outcomes.
So this will take us back to those days where we used to sort of huddle around the television and see what the announcement was going to be at 5 o'clock and kind of sigh, you know, hopelessly when they said, and so we will now be asking you to go to the pub only with 6 people and only to eat something as well as having a drink. And so we might get to find out exactly who came up with that and which idiot decided that was a good idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, you say sigh, I would say scream, actually. Particularly in January when, you know, your kids are going to be off school for another 2 months. There was no sighing involved at that point. But yeah, well, we might or we might not, because, of course, the other story today is that Sunak's WhatsApp messages, there's been another wrangle over, you know, I'm sure your viewers will be aware of the wrangle over Boris's WhatsApp messages back in June. That ended up in court, actually. And the result of that is that the Boris WhatsApp messages are in part going to be released to the inquiry. I say in part because rather unbelievably, he is claiming that the messages from, I think, 31st of January it is, till the beginning of June, 7th of June, have not been retrieved from his phone. He's unable to explain why. You know, obviously that's a pretty key period.
This is the other phone situation, isn't it, where he couldn't figure out how to open the phone, and he was worried, apparently, that if he opened it the wrong way, that all the messages would be wiped. So therefore he's not opening it.
Exactly. So we've got some of his messages, not all. And now Sunak is saying, oh, well, actually, I've also changed phones a few times. And surprise, surprise, my messages don't seem to have been recorded. And I think, you know, you can laugh about this, but this is a really, really serious point.
Well, do you know, I laugh not because it's funny, but because I'm so exasperated by the way that they continually dodge the bullet. I find it extraordinary. I mean, I've just got a new phone, literally 2 weeks ago, and funnily enough, all of my messages have been transferred from the old phone. I mean, what politicians have special phones, apparently, that don't do that?
Well, I mean, they're busy tracking all our phones, aren't they? And to claim that the key ministers running the country have no visibility over their past messages, no records, it defies any kind of credibility.
Right.
And actually, it's a really serious point because it speaks to a lack of basic governance, which really, really marked these 3 years. I mean, some of these decisions, and we have unfortunately been going over it in an awful lot of detail, haven't we, Mike?
Yeah,
week after week. But there were decisions that lacked any grounding in ethics, in reasonableness, in any proportionality. This idea that if you're going to impose an intervention, it needs to be, the harms of the intervention need to be proportionate to the benefit. All of that went out of the window. And now we're being told that the methodology of making the decision has also gone out of the window. I mean, I'm sorry, but just no, this is not good enough. And I really, really hope the inquiry come down incredibly strongly with the force of law if necessary on this, because there is no point having an inquiry if we can't have access to these messages. Like, that is clear. It is very clear that ministers decided to conduct public business in a very private and haphazard manner. That was their decision. But having made that decision, they have opened those WhatsApps to the realm of public investigation and examination, and they must be made available.
So are we expecting then to see some of these former cabinet ministers and maybe still current cabinet ministers appearing before the inquiry? And do they not have enough powers? Is that the other thing you're saying?
Well, it looks like, I mean, what happened with the Boris messages is the inquiry, to be fair to Lady Hallett, and that, I can be harsh on her, but I think, to be fair, they ended up in court over the WhatsApp messages, and I think that was a very, very good call. So I think they need to use every power at their disposal to force disclosure. The answer is yes. Key decision makers, which will include the infamous quad of ministers. So Sunak, Johnson, Gove, Javid, also key other ministers.
Right.
Ought to be appearing in this module. There are some notable absences. At the moment, Gavin Williamson, Education Secretary, has not been called. How you can have a sensible module on school closures, that ought to come into this. And arguably, school closures were they perhaps the single most devastating intervention of the pandemic? I think certainly many parents would say so. How you can have an examination of the decision-making around that without calling the then Education Secretary, I do not know, but that is apparently where we are.
Yeah, it is extraordinary, because I was reading this morning that the former Children's Commissioner, Anne Longfield, who is going to give evidence apparently to the COVID inquiry at some point soon, she's actually linking the increase in stabbing deaths and the increase in violent crime in our cities in this country to the lockdown. She's actually saying, as a result of lockdown, a lot of these kids have now become more violent, more dangerous, and many of them are now taking part in sort of extreme instances of violence every couple of weeks, when in the old days it was every kind of 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, and I think she's entirely right, I'm sure, to do that. And when we stop and start children's education, when we force them out of school, we know, unfortunately, that one of the things that has happened is we have degraded the sanctity, really, of education and schooling, and many of them simply have not returned to the school system. So, persistent absence, that's the number of children who, as it sounds, are regularly, persistently missing school, has doubled since the pandemic. And there's now, I think it's 22.5%, so more than 1 in 5 children are persistently absent from school. I mean, this is just really, really devastating. And it will start, of course, to bleed into other aspects of society. So you've mentioned crime. I think the other aspect that we've not spent enough time talking about, but we need to, is speech and language and communication. So there are apparently 5 million children who are not reaching the expected age milestone goals in speech and language since the start of the pandemic. And we know that there's a very significant correlation between adults with less good communication skills and the number of those adults that end up in prison in the criminal justice system. So there's going to be all these impacts that, bleed through for years, perhaps even decades to come, and they must form a core part of the inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely right. Well, we should watch it with interest, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it again when they finally come up with some answers. But whether they will or not, we shall see. Molly, thanks very much indeed. Molly Kingsley there
Thanks, Mike.
from Us For Them.